like Martin Luther, like Da Vinci, like William Shakespeare, and he was such a swagger too.
Chapter 17, Section 3, Luther leads the Reformation. So if you remember from the last few sections, there's sort of this shift going on in Europe where the church is slowly losing ground as people are becoming more critical of the various practices the church has, such as indulgences, which we'll talk about in a moment, as well as how the church is charging money for everything, whether it be baptisms, marriages, and people are becoming skeptical in regards to the church's role in society. As these doubts are beginning to be casted on the church, we have a few things that are happening in society to sort of expedite the situation. For example, through the Renaissance that started in Italy, there's humanism and more secular values spreading throughout Europe. Furthermore, these ideas are spreading at a much quicker pace than it would have had in the previous centuries because now we have the printing press through Johannes Gutenberg. So to make things simple, I summarize into SPER. Social, political, and economic and religious reasons. So socially, people are beginning to question the church more, and this concept of focusing more on man over God is beginning to spread. Politically, people were beginning to question the Pope's power, especially for those who resided outside of Rome, who felt like, well, the Pope is in Rome. So if you're, let's say, someone in England, someone in France, why should you be under the power of someone in another country? Economically, pretty much anyone who wasn't part of the church wasn't happy with all the wealth and money the church was getting. You had royalty feeling like they should get the money, not the churches, and you had individual people, especially the growing class of merchants, feel like they deserve to have more pay instead of giving their money in the form of taxes to the church. And finally, in regards to the church itself, they were incredibly corrupt. They were accepting money such as sales of indulgences. What this meant was they were accepting people's money to get rid of their sins. So this all leads to a very, very important moment in the fall of 1517 when Martin Luther, a priest and monk himself, had gone to the churches in Wittenberg and he put up these 95 points he made, which would bring up the idea that people were able to reach salvation through belief alone. Right? They did not need to go through priests and the Pope in order to reach salvation. Luther was incredibly critical of the church's practices, especially that of selling indulgences, right? Making money off of absolving people of their sins. So hopefully this meme that sometimes in my classroom makes a bit more sense now. So when we're talking about nailed it, talking about literally Martin Luther nailing 95 theses on the church door. Perhaps one of the strongest quotes by Luther in the 95 Theses is, "Why does not the Pope, whose wealth today is greater than the wealth of the richest Crassus, build the Basilica of St. Peter with his own money rather than with the money of the poor believers?" So he's very critical that the Pope, despite having money, is still asking people to donate to the church so that he can build greater infrastructure and greater facilities for the Catholic Church. So at the very initial points of this movement, the church was actually not super concerned about Luther. They looked at him as, one monk, one priest that has sort of gone out of control, and that, some people might follow his beliefs, but he wasn't a real threat. However, it turns out with the printing press, with this mounting amount of tension and animosity people had towards the church, Luther's ideas gained traction. And as a result, he was brought to Rome, questioned, and ultimately Pope Leo X excommunicates Luther. Furthermore, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V also made it public that he too opposed Luther and declared him as an outlaw and a heretic. So Luther himself was now a man wanted and excommunicated from the very church he worked for, but now his ideas were spreading like wildfire. So it's interesting how this all played out because ultimately Luther was actually able to evade authorities and run away, and he was able to return to the Holy Roman Empire without ever being arrested. And the reason why he was never captured and the addictive worms were not enforced was because the Holy Roman Empire was at war at the time and did not have time to focus on Martin Luther. So initially, the movement started by Luther garnered quite a bit of support, and many people began to attack churches. However, this was not Luther's intentions. His intentions were that people should be able to find God and reach salvation through faith and prayer only, right? Not to actually go on and attack the churches. So he soon condemned these actions. But many of the peasants who were thinking that they were following Luther felt kind of betrayed by him. At the same time, you had another whole class of people supporting this movement, and these were the loyal families who they felt that it was a good opportunity to take the church's property and gain power through using Lutheranism as an excuse. Now, this wasn't the first time where a leader starts some kind of movement and then the followers become violent, and then that same leader has to go on and advocate and try to convince those who follow them, that violence is not the way. So it's very interesting to see how history repeats itself. So when you look at Christianity before the Great Schism, the East-West Schism, it actually starts as one, right? And as you can see in this nice little image here, it slowly spreads into different pieces. Today we have hundreds, if not thousands, of different types of Christian sects. But on the right side, you can see how when Catholicism spreads, you can see various Protestant branches emerge on the top right there, whether it's Anabaptist, Protestants, and obviously Protestants split up into many more categories. So this is a nice one just to maybe take a screenshot of. It gives you a good overview. This is directly from the textbook of Leadership, Salvation, Bible, Worship, Service, and Interpretation of Beliefs of Anglican Calvinism, Lutheranism, and Roman Catholicism side by side. And you'll notice, some are similar, some are different. And you may notice why the three on the right are in the same category, whereas the one on the left is separate. So let's talk a bit about England now. So England at the time, there's already movements sort of going against the Pope and the Catholic Church, and the English people are led by this guy here, Henry VIII. And Henry VIII found this to be a great opportunity to pursue his personal politics through taking advantage of the situation around him of this spreading Protestant beliefs. So who was Henry VIII? He's a very, very complex character in the sense that there's really two periods of Henry VIII. In the early days, he was this young, athletic, charismatic, somewhat smart and intellectual individual who led the nation. However, as he grew older, one of the major negative events in his life that happened was an accident in fencing, which gave him a pretty severe injury on his leg, resulting in ulcers in his leg, which he struggled with for the rest of his life. He also gained a bunch of weight, and a part of that, a lot of historians speculate, is why he was also so insecure about his image near women. Now, he's probably most well known for 6 marriages, as well as his role when it comes to establishing the Church of England, which we'll get to later on. But let's first look at his marriages. A not so great record. We're talking about 2 divorces, 2 executions, 1 who dies, and only 1 who survived him. And when we look at his various relationships, the key thing is that he wanted to have a son. He wanted an heir for his throne. His first wife couldn't have a son, had a daughter. They also had miscarriages. He also had wives that were incapable of having babies. And ultimately, he did have 1 son who ironically would pass away at a very young age. So 6 wives were Catherine, Anne, Jane, Anne again, Catherine, and Catherine again. So how do all these personal relationships with Henry VIII relate to the Church of England? Well, how it came into play is when he wanted to get a divorce and the Catholic Church refused to do so. When Henry VIII realized he wasn't going to get his way, he realized that the events going around him in Europe, with people separating from the church, he found this was a perfect timing for him to establish his own church through the Act of Supremacy in 1534, rendering him as the supreme head of the Church of England. As mentioned earlier in this section, people already were not that much fans of the Pope or Rome. So in fact, when this happened, the English people didn't really go against Henry, and they kind of went along, and they were like, all right, we have our own church now. Following Henry's death, his son was crowned at the young age of 9. So even though he was technically king, it was really his advisors who were making the decisions, and really he never had any impact because at the age of 15, he resigned due to poor health and eventually passed away. After his death, Mary took over, and Mary did actually the exact reverse of what Henry did, and she wanted England to go back to becoming part of the Catholics and go under the power of the Pope. This created a lot of issues within England because there are people who wanted to stay away from the Catholic Church, and there were also plenty of people who wanted to actually come back to the Catholic Church. And when Mary passes, Elizabeth I takes over, and she did a great job in balancing this issue. She realized that the solution for, not just this, but obviously many other issues, is moderation. She said the Church of England will continue to have various services that are very Catholic influenced, such as the hymns that are sung or the clothing, but at the same time, there's sort of an English twist to it where Anglican, so the English Church of England priests can get married, right, whereas Catholic priests cannot get married. Right? The key thing here, again, is good leaders are about making compromises. So from 1558, Elizabeth I takes over, also known as the Virgin Queen. She ruled for over 40 years and was strong-willed, a very powerful queen. Like 44 years, almost half a century. She was a gifted scholar who was able to speak in various languages, and she had notable successes, including perhaps her greatest success was a major military victory when the English forces were able to defeat the Spanish Armada. It was during Queen Elizabeth's reign where we see a great emergence of power, technology of England. That was once considered sort of behind places like France and Italy catch up, and by the turn of the 17th century, England was growing into a powerhouse. Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act, blah, 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 blah. Have a nice day. Goodbye.
Changed it like Dominitz, wrote it like William Shakespeare, and he was such a swagger too.